Hello everyone, it's Crystal. Welcome to part 3 of the Library Quilt Along. In this video I will show you how to square up your blocks so that all the sides are straight, and I will show you how to lay out your blocks if you don't have a design wall. You can use a bed, you can use a floor. The idea of laying out your blocks is that so you can see the entire quilt, you can take pictures, change the layout, take more pictures so you can decide on the final design. Let's get started. Before we arrange our blocks, we need to square them up. As I stated previously, my blocks will be squared up to 12.5 inches square, and my finished block will be 12 inches. I'm doing a 5 by 5 layout. 5 blocks across, 5 blocks down. That's a total of 25 blocks. I decided that I wanted to have some books that will be horizontal. So I sewed those first because that takes some thought, and I wanted to make sure I did it right. When you have, this is an example of a block that will have horizontal books. And when you stack books in real life, real books, you put the largest or the longest book on the bottom. So I made sure that and I marked those blocks with this blue clip to make sure that I kept the orientation correct. So this block will be in my quilt as a horizontal block. This is the longest book, and it's on the bottom, to shorter blocks on top. So I just wanted to show you that before I show you how I square up my blocks. When I took my blocks to the ironing board, I placed them like this with the wrong side up and the white fabric towards me, and I had my iron on my right side, and I made sure that I ironed these seams down towards the dark. And just to make it easier for myself, I pressed all of my seams to the left. Since I'm right-handed, I just picked up the iron, pressed the seams to the left, because for the white part of the fabric, you may be able to see the seam allowance. So I wanted all the seam allowances to go in the same direction. So let's get started with our squaring. For all of my blocks, I'm going to start with the end for the books, because I want this to be straight, because this part will be sewn into my fabric that I'm using for my shelf. So I bought this brown fabric to use for my shelf. I believe it's 1.5 yards, I'm not sure, but it's a 40 inch wide fabric. I bought it last year, so I don't remember exactly how much I bought, but it's definitely more than 1 yard. So I'm going to cut this fabric into strips 2.5 inches wide, so that each of my shelves will be 2 inches finished. And I'm also planning to use this fabric as my binding, but that may change. So here's my 12.5 inch square ruler. So I have plenty of fabric. So I'm going to just make sure this end is straight. I'm going to line up one of these lines with my seam. And one other thing I did is I did 5 different sizes of strips: 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5. And I would put my wide fabrics on the ends, so that if I needed to slice off part of the end, I would still have a good sized chunk for a book. So I'm going to just line up this 6-inch line with this seam right here. I'm going to take, the block is bigger, but that's okay because some of that's going to be cut off. So I'm going to start on the strip, go backwards, and then go forward. And then pick up my block and rotate it And I actually like this fabric better, so I'm going to try to save as much of this fabric as I can. And I'm going to have to line that up to make that straight. So I'm going to cut off part of the pink over here. I'm going to make sure my seams are straight. And I'm going to start on the fabric, go backwards, then go forward. And this is trash. I'm not using my cutting mat, my rotating cutting mat, because my rotating cutting mat is only 12 inches square. So this is actually bigger than that mat. So once again, line up my corners right here. Make sure that's straight. Make sure that I can line up one of my seams with a straight line. Then I'm going to start on the fabric, go backwards, and then go forward. And this is trash, or I could use it for another project. And then our fourth side. Make sure all my sides are lined up. Take my rotary cutter, go back, and go forward. And now my block is 12.5 inches square. Then make sure I put my clip back on so I can remember that this will be a horizontal block. So I made 7 of these to begin with because I want to put one horizontal block in each of my rows. I made 7 just so I can have some options, and I made 28 blocks total. But last night I remembered that if you have a bookcase, you need bookends. So I made some bookends today. This afternoon, I have a Brother Scan and Cut, and this image is one of the patterns that comes in the Scan and Cut. I maximized it to, I think it's 10 and a quarter was the tallest that you could make the scales of justice. So this is going to be a bookend. I made 2. Here's my other color. So I cut them in. After I cut them with my Scan and Cut, well, I cut the fabric into a 12-inch square. I put heat and bond light on the back, and then I cut it with my Scan and Cut. After I remove this image from my Scan and Cut, I cut it in half. This white fabric, I made it, I think 14 by 8 or something, because I am going to trim it down to 12.5 by 6.5. So I have 28 of the blocks of the books, and then I have 4 of these half blocks. So I'm only going to use 23 blocks of the books, and I'm going to put this on 2 rows for my quilt. I didn't want to do one for each row. I thought that would be too much. But this is one of the benefits of not working with a pattern. When you get inspiration to try something new, you can just include it into your quilt. So once again, this was from the Brother Scan and Cut. I maximized it, cut it out. I used heat and bond light on the back of the fabric. Cut out this pattern with my Brother Scan and Cut. I removed this image from my mat, and then I ironed this gold fabric. It's actually called curry. It's a Kona color. Curry fabric. I pressed this onto the white background, and then I used a blanket stitch on my sewing machine to just tack it down so that the raw edges would be covered. And I placed it about a little more than 1/4 inch from the edge, because this is a straight edge. I actually cut this today, so I know that this is straight. So when I sewed this to one of my blocks, one of my book blocks, it'll probably be like this, then I know that this white part should be mostly covered. So it'll look like this bookend is holding these books. It wouldn't be this horizontal, it'd be a vertical, but that's the same concept. So if you get inspiration to add some blocks to your quilt, feel free to personalize it as much as you want. Next, I will take, after I square up all of my blocks, my whole blocks and my half blocks here, I will take all of the blocks to my guest room. I have a queen size bed in the guest room. I'm going to lay out my blocks on the bed. My design wall that I have down here is not quite big enough for this quilt. In the end, this quilt should be 60 by 70. So the next thing I'll show you is my blocks on the guest room bed. When I originally laid out my blocks on the bed, I laid them out as 5 blocks across and 5 rows down, and I took a picture of the layout. I let the layout sit there overnight. When I looked at the picture, I saw that I wanted to change some of the blocks around. When I went to change the layout, I decided to add the remaining 5 blocks into the quilt. So now my quilt is 5 blocks across and 6 rows down. My finished quilt will be 60 inches wide by 84 inches long. That is one of the benefits of creating your own pattern. You can change things as you want, and there's no right or wrong answer. So lay your blocks out, let them sit, take some pictures, change things around, and play around with your layout. In our next video, part 4 of the Library Quilt-Along, I will give you some tips on sewing your rows so that you can have even rows and even stitching. I'll see you in the next video.